Growing up, I spent many days playing and exploring outside. My home was surrounded by the beautiful salt marshes of South Carolina, where life was rich with unique traditions and fascinating tales. The people there believed strongly in magic and spiritual forces, which made the place feel mysterious. Though I often heard strange stories, I didn't pay them much mind. In South Carolina, almost everyone who stays there for a while has their own eerie story to tell. I had heard many of these stories, but I never thought I would have my own to share. When I became a park ranger, I wanted to stay close to my home, so I took a job at a state park in the southern part of South Carolina. During my first weeks on the job, campers started reporting something unusual. They heard strange, high-pitched screeching sounds that echoed through the park at night. It wasn't just the noises that were puzzling. The campers also noticed an unusual number of moths fluttering around. The combination of the screeching sounds and the sudden appearance of so many moths made me wonder what could be causing such odd happenings in the park. Our coastlines were facing a big problem because of invasive tallow trees. These trees were spreading quickly and causing trouble for the local plants and animals. To solve this, the government decided to release certain insects, including moths, to eat the seeds of these trees and help stop their spread. Because of this, I started patrolling the park more often, keeping an eye on everything. One day as I walked through the woods, something felt different. The forest around me seemed unusually alive, as if the trees and plants were more awake than usual. Though everything looked just like it always did, there was an odd sense that the woods were drawing me in, making me want to explore deeper. It's hard to describe, but the feeling was unlike anything I had experienced before. I was familiar with the peculiar ways of this area, so I wasn't too surprised. However, when I began to hear that strange, high-pitched noise, it was entirely new to me. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard in the woods, and it made me feel both curious and cautious. There was a strange urgency to the noise, almost like it was calling me. I decided to follow the sound through the woods, hoping to find its source. As I walked, I couldn't see any particular bird or animal that might be making the noise. It was puzzling, as the sound didn't seem to come from anything I could recognize. While exploring, I stumbled upon a peculiar path. The vines and plants along the trail were twisted and bent into very odd shapes, like they had been carefully arranged that way. I remembered a bit of local folklore that spoke of something called sigils. These are special symbols that some people believe can call upon different spirits, both good and bad, to bring about various things. Although I didn't put much stock in those old stories, the shapes of the vines looked strange and unnatural, making me feel a bit uneasy. But since I wasn't superstitious, I decided to keep going. I followed the path marked with these mysterious symbols, curious to see where it led. The winding trail seemed to guide me deeper into the woods, the sound growing louder as I went. I came upon a small circular clearing that surrounded a massive tree. This tree was incredibly large, with a trunk that was about 5 feet wide. Around this giant tree, there was a space about 3 feet across, and then, like a natural fence, a ring of smaller trees encircled the clearing. They stood close together, forming what looked like a wooden wall around the huge tree in the open space. The arrangement of these trees was very unusual, almost as if they had been planted to create this special spot. The way they stood in a perfect circle made the place feel different, like it was meant for something important. I thought it looked pretty cool, but as I continued to follow the sound, I felt stranger and stranger. This feeling was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was as if my own instincts were telling me to turn back and leave. My stomach felt uneasy, and a small voice inside seemed to whisper that I should go back. But instead of stopping, this feeling made me even more determined to keep going. I wanted to understand what was so important that my instincts were urging me to retreat. The sense of mystery and the desire to know the truth pushed me forward, even though everything inside me felt like it was pulling in the opposite direction. I circled the clearing around the enormous tree several times, looking for anything unusual. After a few rounds, I noticed a smaller path leading out from the area surrounded by trees. This narrow trail was clearly marked on the ground, though it was almost hidden by the thick growth of thorny bushes. As I approached this overgrown path, a strong feeling washed over me, urging me to stop and not go any further. My whole body felt uneasy, like it was warning me to turn back, but instead of listening to that feeling, I decided to press on and find out what was ahead. I used my walking stick to push aside the brambles that blocked the way. Carefully, I made my way along the narrow path, which was quite short, but had an odd darkness about it. The ground seemed scorched, as if it had been burned a long time ago, making the path appear dark and unusual. As I followed the path, it took a turn and led me to a small spot in the woods. This area was no bigger than 5 feet by 5 feet, and everything in it was burnt. The ground, the plants, and the trees all looked charred and blackened, as if a fire had swept through just this tiny part of the forest. In the middle of this small burnt clearing stood a single tree, right in front of me. Its branches were bare, and it looked as though it had been burnt like everything else around it. The tree in front of me was charred, with its top half completely burnt. The trunk, about a foot in diameter, stood blackened and rough, like it had been through a fierce fire. As I gazed at this tree, I thought I could hear a low mumbling sound, almost like whispers. Suddenly, a loud crash erupted from my left, coming from the small trail I had just walked on. Startled, I dropped to the ground, my heart pounding. Lying there, I saw a shadowy figure moving up the path. The figure was strange, with an outline that seemed to have feathers. It was very tall and looked a bit like a person, but it was very thin and almost sickly in appearance. The figure moved from tree to tree, not far from where I was hiding, its head snapping back and forth as if searching for something. It kept making that low mumbling sound as it moved. Then it lifted its head and let out that same screeching noise I had heard before. Its face was frightening, with no clear features except for terrible red eyes that seemed to glow. By this time, I was lying flat in the tall grasses, trying to stay hidden. I watched in awe as the figure spread its large, leathery wings. In an instant, it shot down the path at an incredible speed, faster than anything I had ever seen. The sight of it was both amazing and terrifying, and I stayed very still until it was out of sight. That moment is one I will always remember. It happened so quickly, like the blink of an eye, yet it was so powerful and striking that it is etched into my memory forever. The strange figure shot off down the path, then seemed to lift up into the trees and disappear into the distance. As soon as it vanished, I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I didn't even think about which direction to go. I just wanted to get away from there as fast as I could. I ran through the woods, not following the way I had come. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it was far from that place. Eventually, I burst out of the forest and almost ran straight into someone's campsite. I had to quickly calm myself down and act normal as I made my way back to the ranger station, pretending that everything was fine. When I gave my report to my supervisor, you can imagine how strange it must have sounded. All they could really do was to tell the other rangers to watch out for some kind of mysterious walking and flying creature. I didn't talk about what happened to anyone else for a long time until just recently. Now I've shared it with you. Even though a few years have passed since that day, I still have no idea what I saw or heard in the woods. The memory of that figure with its red eyes and leathery wings remains as vivid and unexplained as ever. I listen to your show a lot, and now I have my own strange story to share. I live in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, which is a very beautiful place. But what I saw the other day wasn't something natural. Many people say the end of days is near because of the virus and other things, and I never believed that talk, but now I'm not so sure. I work at a gas station on a very lonely road, surrounded by farms as far as you can see. It's often quite boring, and most of the time the owner Billy and I just sit around and chat. I often wonder how Billy manages to pay his bills because the gas station doesn't seem to make much money. But that's his business, not mine. I'm just happy to have a job right now since many of my friends are still out of work. It was a Wednesday, and we were sitting on the chairs he has by the side of the building. We only had 4 customers all day, and Billy was telling me a fishing story he had told me many times before. I was really bored, so I didn't want to tell him to stop talking. I was mostly ignoring him, just nodding my head and saying, "Uh-huh," while he went on with his story. We heard a shotgun fire very close by. That's not unusual around here, but then it fired 2 more times. Billy looked at me and said that a fox was probably in Garner's chicken coop again. I just nodded and said, "Uh-huh." We started talking about raising chickens when all of a sudden we saw something strange. A giant bird-like creature was flying straight over the treetops, heading in our direction. I say bird-like because it wasn't a bird. It looked like a small dragon, even though that might sound like one of Billy's tall tales. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could tell it wasn't a normal creature. Billy was very surprised, just like me. Then we saw it land in the trees right across the road. I couldn't believe my eyes, so I asked Billy, "Did that look like a dragon to you?" He said it didn't look like a dragon, but more like a gargoyle. I've never seen a gargoyle before, so I wasn't sure if he was right. Billy said it must be one of Satan's creatures and decided to get his gun. Now, I have to admit, I was very scared about the idea of going across the street to where the creature had landed. It looked very big as a young calf at least. If it really was from a bad place, who knows what kind of powers it might have. I had serious doubts that Billy's gun would be much help against it. I was sitting there, thinking about how to avoid going over there with Billy, when suddenly we heard a truck coming up the road. From the noise and the bad muffler, I knew it was Jerry Garner's old pickup truck. Jerry screeched into the parking lot a moment later and jumped out, looking very upset. He had his rifle in his hand. Billy asked him if that creature with the wings had come from his place. Jerry said yes. It had been in his barn when he went in to get a feed sack. It was hanging from the rafters upside down. I asked, "Like a vampire?" Jerry shook his head and said, "This isn't a vampire. It's one of Satan's minions." Billy said, "It landed in the trees over there. Let me get my gun, and we'll send it back where it came from." Jerry nodded and mentioned he had already shot at it, but I wasn't sure about that since the creature seemed to be flying just fine. Billy went inside and came out with his gun. He and Jerry started off towards the trees. I quickly said, "Hey, I'll stay here in case we get a customer." They didn't respond, and I felt a bit ashamed, because we all knew I was just saying that because I was scared. They crossed the road, and I watched them until they disappeared into the trees. Once I couldn't see them anymore, I stood in the parking lot and prayed for their safety. I asked God to watch over them and keep them safe. A shotgun blast echoed through the air, followed by another. Suddenly, I saw that creature fly up out of the trees. It didn't look like they hit it. The creature started heading straight for the gas station, and I felt terrified. I quickly changed my prayers, asking the Lord to protect me because I was sure the creature was coming for me. The creature flew right over my head and kept going. I could see its giant leathery wings and a small head shaped like a horse's. It had a tail like a dragon's. It was too high up for me to see its face clearly or to tell what color it was. I was really glad it didn't stop and kept on flying. Billy and Jerry came running back across the road, shouting that they had hit it and looking up at the sky, but the creature was gone. I didn't think they hit it at all. I pointed in the direction it flew, and they were quiet for a moment. There was no way to tell where it was now, so how could they follow it? We all stood there wondering what to do next. Billy went into the store and grabbed a couple of sodas. We all sat down together, still feeling a bit shaken. Jerry said he was going to tell our preacher about what happened. Billy and I nodded, thinking that was probably a good idea. In my opinion, I don't think a man or even 10 men could bring down a creature like that if it came from a bad place. I believe only God and his angels can take care of something like that. That's all I have to say. Thanks for listening, and may the Lord protect us all. I used to work as a security guard in a museum located in the southwestern part of the United States. This museum had a basement that was nearly always locked because it stored many valuable items. Whenever someone needed to go down to the basement to retrieve something, the rules required them to be accompanied by at least one security guard. This rule existed because of an old vague story about an incident that had occurred there many years ago. No one seemed to know exactly what had happened during that incident. We all assumed it was related to an attempted theft or something similar. One day, some repair work needed to be done in the basement, so the museum brought in some contractors. Another security guard and I were assigned to stay down there with the 4 workers for security reasons. The repair job was supposed to last 2 weeks, and every day, something unusual would happen. The basement had an unexplainable atmosphere that made it feel very uncomfortable. Even though I didn't have any particular reason to feel uneasy about the place, being down there for any length of time made my skin tingle. It felt as though someone's eyes were constantly on me, and I always felt very anxious. One day, while we were down there, the lights flickered on and off. The contractors looked around, puzzled, but continued with their work. Another time we heard faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. We searched the entire basement, but found no one else there. On another occasion, one of the workers misplaced his tools, only to find them neatly arranged in a different spot a little while later. Despite the unsettling experiences, we completed our duties, staying vigilant and making sure the workers were safe. The odd occurrences remained a mystery, and the basement continued to be a place that few people dared to enter alone. Even after the repairs were finished, the strange feelings lingered, making us all wonder what really happened in that basement years ago. There always seemed to be work tools missing when we went down to the basement at the start of the day. Mysterious drafts would blow in, and there was a strange metallic smell in the air. The basement didn't have any windows, but there was one spot toward the back that looked unfinished. It resembled a crawl space under part of the building. As far as I knew, it didn't lead outside, so it didn't make sense that we would sometimes feel those drafts. It wasn't all the time, but when it did happen, it seemed to come with that metallic odor. The contractors also seemed uneasy about being down there. They acted like they just wanted to finish their work quickly. Every day was unusually quiet in the basement. They didn't joke around like you'd expect a group of friends to do while working together. They just focused on their tasks and didn't talk much. During the second week, my security colleague, who was usually with me, called in sick. That day, it was just me and the contractors. Everything seemed normal, except it felt extra drafty. At one point, I went to use the bathroom. When I came back, I noticed the workers huddled together, looking worried. They told me they had heard a soft humming sound coming from the crawl space area. I checked the spot but found nothing unusual, though the metallic smell was stronger. We continued our duties, and I tried to keep everyone calm. The contractors worked faster, and the basement felt more unsettling than ever. We all hoped to finish the job soon. Each day felt like an adventure, and we couldn't wait to leave the basement behind. Finally, the repairs were done, and we left the basement, still puzzled by the drafts and smells. We never figured out what caused them, but we were glad the work was over. The basement remained a place of mystery, with secrets hidden in its shadows. A few minutes after I went into the bathroom, I started to hear loud screams coming from the hallway. I rushed out as fast as I could and saw 3 of the workers running up the basement stairs as quickly as possible. They looked terrified. I ran after them, and when we were upstairs, I asked them what had happened. They told me that their colleague, the 4th worker, had walked toward the back of the basement out of sight and had started screaming. The other workers went to look for him but couldn't find him. They were scared because he seemed to have disappeared, and then they heard a loud screeching noise like a giant bird. After that, they heard something scraping along the cement floor coming toward them. They all got scared at once and decided to run. As they told me this, I started to remember some of the strange stories I had heard about the basement before. I had never paid much attention to those stories, but now they seemed important. The basement was indeed a mysterious place with secrets hidden in its shadows. Maybe the fact that no one was allowed to go down to the basement without security had a deeper reason. I called for help and managed to get 2 people to go with me to find the last contractor. When we went down to the basement and headed toward the back area, we were hit with a horrible smell. It was that metallic scent again, but now it was mixed with a rotten sulfur smell. As we went past a pillar at the back of the basement, we finally noticed the worker leaning against it, facing away from us. He looked like he was staring at something. We turned our eyes toward the back and saw this thing standing there. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall and stood on 2 legs. It was like nothing we had ever seen before. It seemed partly human and partly like a giant lizard or dinosaur. The creature had piercing yellow eyes and black claws on its hands, which it held in front of itself. Its head was like a lizard's, and it was staring at us with an aggressive look. The worker was staring back at it like he was paralyzed. He didn't seem to be fully aware of what was happening. His eyes were glassy, and he was mostly non-responsive. We were all frozen for a moment, not sure what to do. The air was thick with tension and that awful smell. We knew we had to get the worker out of there and away from that creature. Summoning all our courage, we slowly approached the worker. One of my colleagues whispered to him, trying to snap him out of his trance. Finally, the worker blinked and looked at us, his eyes still wide with fear. We carefully helped him move away from the creature, keeping our eyes on it the whole time. The creature watched us but didn't move. It just stood there, breathing heavily and staring with those intense yellow eyes. We managed to get the worker back up the stairs and out of the basement. Once we were all safe, we reported what we had seen to our supervisors. They listened carefully and then decided to lock the basement permanently. Only trained professionals would be allowed to investigate further. The basement remained a place of mystery, and we never found out what that creature was or where it came from. But we were glad to be safe and out of its reach. The museum continued to be a place where people could enjoy art and history, but the basement's secrets stayed hidden, only known to a few. I yelled, "Run!" and grabbed his arm, half dragging him behind me as we all took off screaming toward the stairs. I don't even know if that thing followed us. We managed to make it up and slammed the door shut, and I locked it tight. When I looked at the guy, I realized that the back of his jacket had been torn, like slashed and shredded, as if something had clawed at him. There was some blood too, so it broke the skin. We ended up calling an ambulance and sending him to the hospital. The police came too and evacuated the building. They police taped the whole area off. We all gave statements and were sent home, told not to come back to work until we were notified. Well, guess what? After about 2 weeks, we heard that our jobs were no longer available, and we were given some severance pay. I ended up going back to my hometown in Illinois to regroup. To this day, I still don't know what was going on there. When I've tried to describe that day to people, it sounds like I've lost my mind or something. I just tried to let the whole thing go and move on. I've been living on the same block in a town near Lincoln, Nebraska since I was born. My family is just me, Mom, and Dad. We've always been friendly to new neighbors. Over the years, lots of families have moved away, and new ones have moved in. But there's this one house at the end of our block that's been empty for a few months. Then, one evening, I saw a young man doing stuff in the yard. Usually I take our dog for a walk around the block. I thought I'd say hi to the new guy. So I strolled over and greeted him. He looked up and said hello to me and my dog. We chatted for a bit, and I learned his name was Brian, and he was only 22. I thought it was strange for someone so young to own a house, but Brian was really polite and seemed like a nice guy. He told me he had just come back from being in another country for a while. He said he got hurt there, so he had to come back home early. The next day, I decided to bake some cookies for Brian and take them over to his house. I knocked on his door, but nobody answered. I figured I'd catch him later when I walked my dog. I did stuff around my house all day and then took my dog for a walk in the evening. As I got closer to Brian's house, I saw him turn on a light and come out onto the porch. He waved me over and we talked for a while. Brian told me about his time overseas. He said he saw some really tough things and lost a friend. It made me sad to hear about it. He kept talking and then he said something strange. He mentioned the summer of 41. I thought he might have made a mistake and meant 2021. But then he talked about things that happened a long time ago, like war bonds and being a juice jerker. Later, I looked up juice jerker on my computer and found out it was a word people used a long time ago. It meant electrician. It got me thinking. The next day, I planned to go talk to Brian again. But when I looked down the street, I saw someone putting up a for sale sign in Brian's yard. I went over to the lady and told her there must be a mistake because Brian just moved in, but she said the house was still for sale and that nobody had bought it yet. I went back to Brian's house and knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I looked through the windows, but I couldn't see anyone inside, and I never saw Brian again after that. I was sad I didn't get to know him better. One day, my dad saw me looking at an old picture of my grandpa with some friends from when he was in the army. I pointed to one of the men in the picture and told my dad that he looked like Brian. My dad said, "Oh, that's Brian. He was your grandpa's childhood friend." I was amazed. It all made sense now. I had met my grandpa's friend Brian without even knowing it. In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers kiss the clouds and the streets buzz with life, an extraordinary event unfolded on a chilly autumn evening. It began with a soft hum, barely audible amidst the cacophony of the city, but soon it grew into a resonating melody that reverberated through the streets. As the people of New York went about their evening routines, heads turned skyward, drawn by an inexplicable pull. High above the city, a formation of shimmering lights danced across the night sky, weaving intricate patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics. At first, the sightings were dismissed as mere illusions or tricks of the light. But as more and more witnesses came forward with their accounts, it became clear that something truly remarkable was unfolding above the city. The news spread like wildfire, igniting a frenzy of excitement and speculation among the people of New York. Crowds gathered in parks and on rooftops, their eyes fixed on the spectacle unfolding above them. Some whispered of government experiments or secret military maneuvers, while others speculated that the lights were a sign of extraterrestrial visitors from distant worlds. But amidst the speculation and excitement, one thing remained certain. The sight of the UFOs was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that united the city in wonder and awe. As the night wore on, the lights gradually faded into the darkness, leaving behind a sense of mystery and intrigue that lingered in the air long after they were gone. And though the people of New York returned to their daily lives, the memory of that extraordinary evening would remain etched in their minds forever, a reminder of the boundless wonders that awaited them in the vast expanse of the universe.